The moment I saw Patricia Reynolds from the HOA standing in my heated storage unit with her arms full of inflatable snowmen, I knew my life was about to become a living nightmare. I had just returned from a 3-week work trip to Seattle, exhausted and ready to grab some old files from my storage unit on my property in Charlotte, North Carolina. The storage building sat at the back corner of my 2-acre lot, temperature-controlled and securely locked. Or at least it was supposed to be locked. When I pulled up that cold November afternoon, the door was wide open, and inside looked like Santa's workshop had exploded. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I stepped inside, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. Patricia jumped, nearly dropping the snowman. She was exactly what you would picture when someone says HOA board president. Mid-50s, perfectly styled blonde hair despite the early hour, wearing a cream-colored cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. Her expression shifted from surprise to that particular brand of entitlement that only comes from years of telling people what color they can paint their mailboxes. "Oh, Jason, you're back early." She set down the decoration like she had every right to be there. We needed somewhere climate-controlled to store the neighborhood holiday decorations, and since you were gone, we thought you wouldn't mind if we borrowed your storage space temporarily. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. "You broke into my private property." "Don't be dramatic. Margaret from the architectural committee has a key. She made a copy when you had her check your shed permits last year." Patricia waved her hand dismissively, as if breaking and entering was just a minor social faux pas. "Besides, this is technically a community service. These decorations cost the HOA over $15,000. I walked deeper into my storage unit, my blood pressure rising with each step. My furniture, carefully wrapped and stored, had been shoved against the walls. Boxes containing my late father's belongings were stacked haphazardly in corners, some crushed under the weight of plastic reindeer. My vintage motorcycle parts, which I had been collecting for years, were pushed aside to make room for strings of lights and wooden nativity figures. "You moved all my stuff. You damaged my property." I picked up a crushed box that had contained my dad's old baseball card collection. The corner was completely caved in. Patricia sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Nothing important was damaged, Jason, and really, you should be thanking us. Your storage space was just sitting here empty half the time anyway. We saw it as an opportunity for community cooperation. Get out." My voice was calm but deadly serious. "Excuse me. Get out of my storage unit now and take your decorations with you." Patricia's face flushed red. "I will do no such thing. The neighborhood holiday display is this weekend. We have nowhere else to keep these items until then. You will just have to deal with this minor inconvenience for the good of the community. This is private property. You're trespassing. Get out or I'm calling the police." She pulled herself up to her full height, which was still a good 6 inches shorter than me. "If you cause problems with the holiday display, the HOA board will fine you for failure to support community activities. It's in the bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4. I pulled out my phone. "What are you doing?" Patricia demanded, calling my lawyer. "And then the police." I stepped outside and dialed Robert Chen, my attorney who had helped me with the property purchase 2 years ago. Patricia followed me out, her face now matching the red of the Santa suits packed in my storage unit. "You're making a huge mistake, Jason Baxter. The HOA board runs this neighborhood, and we will make your life very difficult." Robert answered on the 3rd ring. I explained the situation while Patricia stood there, arms crossed, radiating indignation. After a few minutes, Robert told me exactly what I needed to hear. I had every right to remove the items from my property, and their entry without permission constituted trespassing and possibly breaking and entering, depending on how they obtained and used the key. I hung up and looked at Patricia. "You have 1 hour to remove everything from my storage unit. After that, I'm calling the police. The neighborhood display is in 3 days. Where are we supposed to store everything? Not my problem. You should have thought about that before breaking into my property." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Finally, she pulled out her own phone and started making angry calls. Within 30 minutes, my driveway was full of board members and volunteers, all shooting me dirty looks as they hauled decorations out of my storage unit. Margaret Fleming, the woman who had apparently made the unauthorized key copy, was a short, round woman in her 60s with curly gray hair. She couldn't meet my eyes as she carried out boxes of ornaments. "Margaret," I called out as she passed, "I'm going to need that key back." She fumbled in her pocket and handed it over without a word, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The last person to leave was Patricia, who stopped in front of me with a look of pure venom. "This isn't over, Mr. Baxter. The board meets tomorrow night, and you will be the primary topic of discussion. I hope you're prepared for the consequences of your selfishness. I'm prepared to sue the HOA and you personally if you ever set foot on my property without permission again." She left without another word, tires spitting gravel as she peeled out of my driveway. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through my storage unit, documenting all the damage. Several boxes were crushed, my father's baseball cards were scattered and mixed up, and worst of all, a rare carburetor for my vintage Triumph motorcycle had a crack in it. That single part was worth over $800 and had taken me 2 years to find. The next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA. I had been summoned to an emergency board meeting that evening to discuss my hostile and non-community-oriented behavior. The letter hinted at fines and potential legal action if I didn't appear. I called Robert again. "Can they fine me for this?" I asked. "Let me pull up your HOA bylaws." I heard typing on his end. "Okay, I'm looking at Section 12, Paragraph 4 that she mentioned. It says homeowners are encouraged to participate in community activities, but there's nothing mandatory about it. And there's definitely nothing that gives them the right to use your property without permission. They're bluffing, Jason. But I'd recommend going to the meeting with a recorder and documentation of all the damage, and send them a formal demand letter for compensation before the meeting." I spent the afternoon writing up a detailed list of damages and taking photographs. The total came to about $3,000. The motorcycle part, damaged boxes, crushed items, and the cost of having to reorganize everything. I emailed it to the HOA board with a demand for payment within 30 days. The emergency board meeting was held at Patricia's house, a massive colonial-style home that screamed old money. When I arrived, about 20 residents were already there, most of them giving me hostile looks. I recognized some of my neighbors. Tom and Sarah Peterson from across the street, elderly Mr. Harrison from 2 houses down, and Jennifer Newman, a single mom who lived next to the neighborhood entrance. Patricia called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a speech about community values and cooperation. She painted me as a selfish villain who had sabotaged the neighborhood holiday display out of spite. "Jason Baxter has shown a complete disregard for our community traditions," Patricia announced to the room. "Because of his actions, we now have nowhere to store our decorations, and our holiday display may not happen this year." Several people shook their heads and muttered disapprovingly. "May I speak?" I stood up without waiting for permission, Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I suppose." I pulled out my phone and held it up. I'm recording this for legal purposes, as is my right in North Carolina, a one-party consent state. First, let me clarify what actually happened. The HOA board, without my knowledge or permission, broke into my private storage unit on my private property. They moved my belongings, causing over $3,000 in damage. This was done while I was out of town and unable to consent or object. The room shifted uncomfortably. Furthermore, a key to my property was made without my authorization, which constitutes an illegal copy in the context of how it was used. When I discovered this trespass and asked them to remove their items, I was threatened with fines and legal action. I looked directly at Patricia. The HOA does not have the right to commandeer private property for its use. If you needed storage, you should have rented it or asked permission. We did this for the community. Patricia stood up, her voice rising. Sometimes individual convenience needs to take a backseat to the greater good. The greater good doesn't include breaking and entering, I replied calmly. I've sent the board a formal demand for compensation for the damages. If it's not paid within 30 days, I'll be filing a lawsuit against the HOA and individually against board members who participated in or authorized this action. The room erupted. Some people started arguing that I was being unreasonable, while others seemed to realize the HOA had seriously overstepped. Jennifer Newman raised her hand. Patricia, is it true you made a key to his property without asking? Jennifer's voice was quiet but firm. We had permission to access the property for the permit inspection last year, Patricia said defensively. Margaret simply kept the key for future reference. That's not the same as permission to enter whenever you want, Jennifer said. She looked at me. I don't blame Jason for being angry. How would we feel if someone did this to us? Thank you, I said. I'm not trying to ruin anyone's holiday. I'm just asking that my property rights be respected and that I be compensated for the damage caused. A man I didn't recognize stood up. He introduced himself as Dale Morrison, another board member. Jason, what if we pay for the damages? Would you be willing to let us use the storage space until after the holidays? We could draw up a proper agreement. Before I could answer, Patricia cut in. Absolutely not. We will not be extorted into paying for imaginary damages. The board will not authorize any payment, and furthermore, I move that we fine Jason Baxter $500 per day until he issues a formal apology to this community. The room went silent. Robert had warned me this might happen, but hearing it out loud was something else. I smiled, which seemed to unnerve Patricia. That's fine, I said. My lawyer will be adding harassment and attempted extortion to the lawsuit. Have a good evening, everyone. I walked out to my car while chaos erupted behind me. I could hear Patricia trying to call for a vote and other voices arguing. My phone rang before I even got home. It was Jennifer Newman. Jason, I'm so sorry about all this. A lot of us had no idea what Patricia and the others had done. That's not okay. I appreciate that, Jennifer. For what it's worth, I'm going to vote against any fines at the next official meeting, and I think you should know that some of us are already talking about calling for a vote to remove Patricia from the board. That was interesting. Keep me posted, and thanks for speaking up tonight. Over the next few days, the neighborhood became increasingly divided. Some residents put up signs supporting the HOA and the holiday display. Others, apparently learning the full story, started questioning the board's actions. My mailbox became a war zone of notes, some calling me a Grinch, others expressing support. On the third day after the meeting, I received another certified letter. The HOA board had voted to fine me $500 per day, starting immediately, for failure to support community activities and displaying hostile behavior toward board members. The letter was signed by Patricia Reynolds, Margaret Fleming, and two other board members I barely knew, Susan Torres and Richard Klein. I forwarded the letter to Robert, who called me back within an hour, laughing. "Jason, this is the best thing they could have done for our case. They're essentially admitting to retaliatory fines in writing. We now have grounds for a much bigger lawsuit." "How much bigger?" "We can go after the HOA's insurance policy, sue for harassment, emotional distress, and possibly get you compensated for any legal fees. Plus, if we can prove that individual board members acted maliciously, we might be able to pierce the corporate veil and go after their personal assets." I thought about it. I didn't want to be at war with my neighborhood, but I also wasn't going to be pushed around. "Let's do it. File the lawsuit." Robert filed the following Monday. The lawsuit named the HOA and all 4 board members who had voted for the fines. We were asking for $10,000 in actual damages, legal fees, and punitive damages to be determined by the court. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Patricia called an emergency meeting, but this time I wasn't invited. According to Jennifer, who was now keeping me informed, the meeting was a disaster. Several residents were furious that their HOA fees were going to be used to defend a lawsuit that the board had brought on themselves. Others were angry that the holiday display still wasn't up because they had nowhere to store the decorations. The next morning, I woke up to find that someone had egged my house and car. I filed a police report, and the officer who responded was sympathetic but realistic about the chances of finding who did it. "Neighborhood disputes like this can get ugly," Officer Williams told me as he took photos of the damage. "Document everything and consider setting up security cameras if you haven't already." I spent that afternoon installing a comprehensive security system with cameras covering every angle of my property, including the storage unit. The timing couldn't have been better. 2 nights later, at around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a security alert. Someone was at my storage unit. I pulled up the camera feed and saw 3 figures in dark clothing trying to force open the lock. I immediately called 911 and then started recording the feed on my phone as backup. The police arrived within 8 minutes. I met them at my front door and showed them the live feed. 2 officers went around back while I stayed at the front with Officer Williams, who had responded to my earlier call. There were shouts, and then the officers came around with 3 people in custody. Even in the dark with hoodies pulled up, I recognized one of them immediately. Richard Klein, HOA board member, age 48, trying to break into my storage unit at 2 in the morning. The other 2 were younger, probably in their 20s. Richard's sons, it turned out. Officer Williams looked at me. "Do you want to press charges?" "Absolutely." Richard started protesting. "This is ridiculous. We were just trying to get a look at what he claimed was damaged. The HOA has a right to investigate fraud." "At 2 in the morning by breaking into his property?" Officer Williams raised an eyebrow. "Sir, you're being charged with attempted breaking and entering and trespassing. Your sons are being charged as accomplices." Watching Richard Klein get put into the back of a police car was surreal. I had only met the man once, at a neighborhood barbecue, and he had seemed perfectly normal. Now he was being arrested on my property in the middle of the night. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Jennifer called me early. "Jason, this is insane. Did you hear Richard got arrested?" I was there. "He and his sons tried to break into my storage unit." "Oh my God. This is getting completely out of control. There's an emergency board meeting tonight at 7. I think you should come. A lot of people are calling for the entire board to resign." I went, bringing my laptop with the security footage. The meeting was packed. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. Patricia looked like she hadn't slept in days, and Margaret Fleming looked ready to cry. Patricia tried to call the meeting to order, but people started shouting questions before she could even speak. Why did Richard try to break into Jason's property? How much is this lawsuit going to cost us? Who authorized entering his storage unit in the first place? Patricia banged a gavel. Everyone calm down. We are handling this situation, and the board stands behind all actions taken for the benefit of the community. A man in the back stood up. I'm Tim Foster, and I'm a lawyer. I've reviewed the case that's been filed, and I have to tell you all that the HOA is going to lose. Badly. They had no right to enter Jason's property. They had no right to issue retaliatory fines. And now a board member has been arrested trying to break in again. Our insurance might not even cover this if they determine the board acted with gross negligence or malice. The room erupted again. Patricia tried to maintain control, but she had lost the crowd. Jennifer stood up. I move for a vote of no confidence in the current board and immediate election of interim members. Seconded. Multiple voices called out. That's not how this works. Patricia's face was bright red. You can't just, actually, according to our bylaws, any motion seconded by at least 5 residents must be put to a vote, Tim Foster said. He had clearly done his homework. I have my copy right here. The vote was overwhelming. Patricia, Margaret, Susan Torres, and the absent Richard Klein were all removed from the board effective immediately. 5 interim board members were elected, including Jennifer and Tim Foster. The first motion the new board passed was to authorize payment of my damages claim and to formally apologize for the previous board's actions. Patricia stood up, trembling with rage. You're all making a huge mistake. I have served this community for 8 years, and this is the thanks I get. Being humiliated and removed because one selfish person couldn't share his storage space for a few weeks. You broke the law, Patricia, Tim Foster said calmly. Multiple laws, actually. You're lucky Jason is willing to settle for damages. He could push for criminal charges. Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed out, Margaret scurrying after her. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to apologize. Some admitted they had only heard Patricia's side of the story. Others said they had been uncomfortable with the situation, but were afraid to speak up against the board. Jennifer pulled me aside. The new board wants to settle this quickly and quietly. Are you willing to accept the $3,000 for damages and drop the lawsuit? I thought about it. The money would cover my actual losses, and I could always refile if they tried anything else. I want one more thing. I want a formal resolution stating that no HOA member may enter private property without explicit written permission, and violations will result in immediate board removal and potential legal action. Done. I'll draft it tonight. We shook hands, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The settlement was finalized within a week. The HOA paid the $3,000 in damages, issued a formal apology, and passed the property rights resolution. Richard Klein's criminal case was still pending, but his arrest had been enough to make the whole neighborhood take notice. The holiday display went up a week late, using a rented storage unit that the HOA paid for with emergency funds. It was smaller than originally planned, but it was up. Some residents complained about the reduced display, but most people were just glad the drama was over. Life started to return to normal. The eggs on my house and car became a funny story rather than a fresh wound. The security cameras stayed up, though, just in case. Then, about 3 weeks after the settlement, I came home from work to find a police car in Patricia's driveway. Officer Williams was there, along with another officer I didn't recognize. I went inside but kept an eye on what was happening through my window. Jennifer called me an hour later. "You're not going to believe this. Patricia's been arrested." "For what?" "Remember those eggs on your house?" The police pulled security footage from a neighbor's camera across the street. It was Patricia. At 53 years old, she was out there at 11 at night throwing eggs at your house like a teenager. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. The mental image was too absurd. "It gets better," Jennifer continued. "When the police showed up to question her today, she apparently lost it and tried to assault one of the officers. So now she's looking at assault on an officer charges on top of vandalism." The case went to court 2 months later. I had to testify about the break-in, the unauthorized use of my storage unit, and the subsequent harassment. Richard Klein's case was heard separately, but he ended up pleading guilty to trespassing and attempted breaking and entering. He got probation and community service, and his sons got lighter sentences due to their age and their father's influence over them. Patricia's case was more serious because of the assault on the officer. She tried to argue that she was defending her home, but the body camera footage clearly showed her attacking the officer without provocation during a routine questioning. She ended up with a conviction for vandalism of my property and assault on a law enforcement officer. The judge gave her 6 months in jail with the possibility of early release for good behavior, 2 years of probation, and mandatory anger management classes. During sentencing, the judge had some choice words. "Miss Reynolds, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust repeatedly. You violated a neighbor's property rights, engaged in harassment and retaliation, committed vandalism, and then assaulted a police officer who was simply doing his job. Your actions have cost your HOA thousands of dollars and destroyed your reputation. I hope you use your time in custody to reflect on how your behavior spiraled so far out of control." Patricia's lawyer tried to appeal, arguing that the stress of the HOA situation had caused a mental break, but the appeal was denied. She served 4 months before being released early. Margaret Fleming, meanwhile, had disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. Someone told me she moved in with her daughter in Florida, too embarrassed to face everyone after her role in the key copying incident. The new HOA board turned out to be much more reasonable. Jennifer became the permanent president, and Tim Foster became the legal advisor. They created new bylaws that included better oversight, term limits, and clear guidelines about respecting property rights. The neighborhood dynamics had shifted. People were more willing to question authority and speak up when something seemed wrong. The holiday display the following year was modest but nice, and this time they rented storage space months in advance. My relationship with the community healed slowly. Some residents never forgave me for ruining the holiday display and getting Patricia arrested, but most people recognized that the previous board had brought it all on themselves. I even joined the landscaping committee, which was ironic given how it all started. About 6 months after Patricia's release from jail, I saw her at the grocery store. She looked older, thinner, her hair now mostly gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was with a cart full of basic groceries, none of the premium brands she used to buy. Our eyes met across the produce section. For a moment, I thought she might cause a scene, but she just looked away and quickly moved to another aisle. I heard later that she had divorced and was living in a small apartment on the other side of Charlotte, working as a receptionist at a dental office. Her time as HOA royalty was long over. Richard Klein moved away about 8 months after his conviction. He sold his house and relocated to Virginia, where apparently his wife's family lived. Good riddance, as far as most of us were concerned. The storage unit incident became neighborhood legend. New residents would hear the story and shake their heads in disbelief. "The HOA actually broke in and used your storage unit," they would ask. When I confirmed it, they always wanted to know every detail. I kept the security cameras up and running. They had paid for themselves several times over in peace of mind. I never had another issue with the HOA, but I also never took that security for granted again. The vintage Triumph motorcycle I had been rebuilding finally got finished about a year after all the drama ended. I used some of the settlement money to replace the damaged carburetor and buy a few other parts I needed. On sunny weekends, I would ride through the neighborhood and kids would wave from their yards. Life was good. Jennifer turned out to be an excellent HOA president. She focused on actual community improvement rather than power trips and enforcement. She organized neighborhood parties, coordinated group landscaping projects that saved everyone money, and established a fund to help residents who fell on hard times. Under her leadership, property values in the neighborhood actually increased, and the community became known as one of the better managed HOAs in Charlotte. I even hosted a neighborhood barbecue at my place the summer after everything settled down. About 30 people showed up, and we grilled burgers and hot dogs while kids played in my yard. Someone asked if they could see the famous storage unit, and I gave tours, pointing out where all the decorations had been stacked. "I can't believe they thought that was okay," one of my neighbors, a woman named Alice who had moved in after the drama, said while looking at the space. "Breaking into someone's property is such a violation." "It taught me a valuable lesson," I replied. "Never assume that just because someone has authority, they have your best interests at heart. Always stand up for your rights, even when it's uncomfortable." The lawsuit settlement money, combined with my regular salary as an IT consultant, allowed me to make some improvements to my property. I added a workshop adjacent to the storage unit, this one with even better security and climate control. I also installed a privacy fence around the backyard, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to establish clear boundaries. Officer Williams, who had responded to multiple calls during the whole incident, became something of a friend. He would sometimes stop by when he was patrolling the area, and we would chat about neighborhood happenings and local crime trends. He told me that the Patricia case had become something of a teaching example at the department about how civil disputes can escalate into criminal matters. "We use it in our community policing training," he explained one afternoon while we sat on my porch. "It shows how important it is to intervene early and enforce property rights before things spiral out of control. If someone had just filed a police report that first day and we had issued a trespass warning, Patricia might never have gone down that road." The baseball card collection that had been damaged in the initial storage unit invasion turned out to be less valuable than I had feared. My dad had been a collector, but most of his cards were common. Still, going through them and reorganizing everything brought back good memories. I kept a few of his favorites in a display case in my living room. About 18 months after the whole mess started, the HOA held elections for permanent board positions. Jennifer ran unopposed for president. Tim Foster became vice president. The other positions went to reasonable people who had shown level heads during the crisis. I was asked if I wanted to run for a position, but I declined. I was happy to participate in committees, but I had no desire to deal with the politics and decision-making of the board. At the annual HOA meeting where the new board was sworn in, Jennifer gave a speech that referenced what happened without naming names. "We learned some hard lessons over the past year and a half," she said. "We learned that power without accountability leads to abuse. We learned that respect for property rights isn't optional. And we learned that when we make mistakes, We need to own them and make things right. This neighborhood is stronger now because of what we went through, and I'm proud to serve as your president." People applauded, and I found myself clapping too. It was a far cry from Patricia's reign of attempted tyranny. The neighborhood holiday display that second year was the best one yet. The new board had solicited design ideas from residents and used HOA funds to purchase new decorations that everyone had voted on. They were stored in a rented climate-controlled unit about 2 miles away, and volunteers took turns managing setup and takedown. Several people thanked me at the holiday party, saying that my willingness to stand up to the old board had made all the positive changes possible. "You could have just gone along with it," Tim Foster told me at the party. "Most people would have, just to avoid conflict. But you stood your ground, and it forced everyone to confront the problems with how the HOA was being run." I appreciated that, but I also knew that I had just been protecting what was mine. I had not set out to reform the HOA or become some kind of property rights crusader. I had just wanted people to stay out of my storage unit. As winter turned to spring and then to summer, life in the neighborhood settled into a comfortable routine. The drama faded into history, though the lessons remained. New residents were given a packet during orientation that included the updated bylaws and a section specifically about property rights and HOA limitations. Jennifer had insisted on including it to make sure everyone understood the boundaries from day one. I expanded my motorcycle collection, buying a second vintage bike and restoring it in my new workshop. The sound of engines revving on weekend afternoons became a familiar neighborhood soundtrack. Some kids in the area became interested in mechanics, and I started an informal mentorship program, teaching teenagers basic motorcycle and car maintenance in my garage. Patricia's name came up occasionally, usually when someone was telling the story to a new resident, but she was no longer a presence in our lives. I heard through the grapevine that she had completed her probation without incident and was living quietly. Part of me hoped she had learned something from the experience, but I doubted I would ever know. The legal fees from the whole ordeal had been substantial, but Robert Chen had been worth every penny. He sent me a Christmas card that year with a note. "Thanks for the most interesting HOA case of my career. Here's hoping it stays boring from now on." As I sat on my porch on a warm July evening, watching the sun set over my property, I reflected on how much had changed. The storage unit that had started everything sat secure and undisturbed at the back of my lot, now protected by cameras, better locks, and a community that understood and respected boundaries. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. The HOA was planning a neighborhood block party for Labor Day weekend, and she wanted to know if I could help with the grill. I typed back a quick yes and smiled. This was what a community was supposed to be: people working together by choice, respecting each other's space and property, and making decisions collectively rather than by dictate. The storage unit incident had cost me time, stress, and money, but it had also resulted in a better neighborhood for everyone. Sometimes standing up for yourself does more than just protect your own interests. Sometimes it forces necessary change that benefits an entire community. I finished my beer and headed inside, locking the door behind me. Through my security camera app, I could see my property lit by motion sensor lights, the storage unit visible and secure. Never again would anyone mistake my private property for community storage. Never again would a power-hungry HOA board member think they could just take what they wanted without consequences. The whole experience had taught me something valuable about the American homeowner experience. HOAs can serve an important function in maintaining property values and organizing community activities, but they require constant oversight and accountability. The moment residents stop paying attention or questioning authority is the moment those in charge start to think they're above the rules. As I got ready for bed that night, I thought about Patricia one last time. I did not feel guilty about what had happened to her. She had made her choices, and those choices had consequences. Every step of the way, she could have backed down, apologized, and worked to make things right. Instead, she had doubled down, tripled down, and ultimately ended up destroying her own life. The next morning, I woke up to another security alert on my phone. My heart rate spiked for a moment before I looked at the screen and laughed. A raccoon was trying to get into my trash can. I watched for a moment as it gave up and waddled away, then reset the alert and got ready for work. Life was back to normal, boring and predictable in the best possible way. My property was mine. My storage unit held only my belongings, and the HOA knew better than to overstep its bounds. Sometimes the best ending is just peace and quiet. The absence of drama and the security of knowing your rights are respected. The neighborhood continued to thrive. Property values went up. New families moved in and old families stayed. The holiday display became an annual tradition that people actually enjoyed rather than resented. Committee meetings were well attended and productive. Disputes were handled fairly and according to established rules. And my heated storage unit remained exactly what it was supposed to be. My private space for my belongings, temperature controlled and secure, never again to be mistaken for community property. The lock I had installed after the incident was top of the line. The cameras were always recording, and the new HOA leadership knew that my property line was not to be crossed without explicit invitation. Years from now, long after I have sold the house, or moved away or grown old in this neighborhood, the story will probably still be told. The time the HOA tried to commandeer a resident storage unit and ended up with board members arrested and in jail. It will be told as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power has limits and rights have meaning. But for now, for me, it is simply over. The conflict has ended, justice was served, the community learned its lesson, and life goes on. Sometimes that is all you can ask for, a fair resolution and the chance to move forward. The storage unit sits in the back corner of my property, holding my things and only my things, exactly as it should be.